Hello, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa, and this week we're going to be looking at executive functions. We'll do this in 4 parts. We're going to begin with the definitions and characteristics of executive functions. Then we'll look a bit at the neurophysiology and 5 key premises, and then we'll look at development and training of executive functions. We'll close by looking again at the risk and protective factors that could be involved in your own personal development of executive functions, as well as those people you work and live with. So what are the definitions of executive functions? We're going to use 2 definitions, one from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University and the other by Adele Diamond in Canada. I like these 2 definitions. They coincide quite a lot, but they break things down in a way that make it much more manageable to consider the sub-elements of executive functions. So the Center for the Developing Child considers that executive functions include the elements of working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive or mental flexibility. This is very similar to the things that Adele Diamond says, which have to do with interference control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So to make this clear, we use executive functions to mentally play with ideas. They're involved in taking time to think before acting, for meeting novel, unanticipated challenges, for resisting temptations, and staying focused. So these 3 elements of inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility are things that we're going to be looking at throughout, and we're going to consider different ways that you can stimulate different sub-elements of executive functions, not executive functions per se, but maybe one of these 3 sub-areas that are considered in these 2 definitions. In one of Diamond's articles, she summarized Beston Miller's table and adds her own information here, looking at these 3 sub-elements across the lifespan. What does this actually look like? How can you observe this type of behavior? So if we're looking at good working memory, this starts off as early as 7 to 9 months. It's observable behavior. The child displays ability to remember an unseen object. And this moves on. She indicates very key milestones throughout where you can watch this progressive development. So 5 to 16 years, the individual develops the ability to search varying locations, remember where something was found, explore other locations, can play this game of concentration, for example. This is similar to inhibitory control. Even small children, 6 months old, are able to not touch something if they're told no. They're able to control themselves there. In older adults, this looks like self-control, situationally appropriate responses, not acting out, resisting saying something that's not socially or politically correct. And similarly with cognitive flexibility, in the earlier years, small children develop the ability to seek alternative methods to retrieve objects beyond directly reaching for what's in view. So there's a certain level of creativity there. As you go up through the ages, then adults are able to revise action and plans in response to changing circumstances. So they're flexible in their way that they approach the problems that are in their path. Diamond's model looks very much like, executive functions is the big umbrella under which you find working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. It's really important to connect executive functions to these 2 big ideas. Remember we discussed there's no new learning without memory or without attention. Well, we have the memory element here. But inhibitory control is really the attention element. This is executive attention, this is effort control, this is deciding what you're going to pay attention to and not letting yourself be distracted. If you're able to achieve these 3 elements in Diamond's model, this can then lead to higher level executive functions. And those executive functions are reasoning, problem solving, and planning. This is basically what your ultimate goal would be, or in the achievement of having good executive functions, you're able to reason, problem solve, and plan. Other models obviously exist. Most of them do include these elements of inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, and working memory. Sometimes they name them different things like impulse control or self-monitoring or flexible thinking. There's different ways of naming these sub-elements. This is why we've chosen to use definitions by the Harvard Center for the Developing Child and Adele Diamond's definitions. To get a better sense of executive functions and also the relationship to self-regulation, we're going to watch a very brief video from the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard.
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors.
We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Don't do that! Justin, look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this?
A toolbox.
A toolbox.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles.
Safety goggles. Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on, a child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn.
Cute.
But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout, and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7. And +4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're hoping to strengthen those neural connections.
You're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
So what is the neurophysiology of executive functions? What does this look like in the brain? Well, a key study by Takeuchi and colleagues identified a very key element here, and that is that while they share this idea that executive functions involve control processes such as goal-oriented planning, flexible strategy generation, sustaining set maintenance, self-monitoring, inhibition, while they agree with that, they also really highlight the key point that what happens in the lab is not the same as what happens in real life. So the activities you can do in an imaging machine are not going to be in parallel with what really happens in real life. So this is a key article that highlights one of the elements that we've talked about a lot in this class in Mind, Brain Health, and Education, that you cannot overgeneralize findings that we're going to be looking at right now. So be skeptical with the information that we're sharing right now. In general, Barbie and colleagues identified several areas. These are identified as Brodmann's areas here. Several key areas of the brain related to executive functions. And we often think of, well, executive functions as really frontal lobe activity. Well, to a great degree, yes, but there's also this very big connection with the motor cortex and how you inhibit, activity, you inhibit control with things, and also what you say and how you interpret things. So these things are also included in executive functions. And if you want to give them very specific names here, this is listed as Brodmann's area, but if you'd like to know the exact physiology, you can look at this graph, which uses the exact same areas, but they identify them with their names as opposed to Brodmann's area. So when we talk about Brodmann's area 10 here, it's actually identifying the lateral frontopolar cortex. So if you'd like to get the specific names, you can look at this article as well. Other models, like Wankel's article, which actually was looking at attention problems, but documented in the process the executive function network, shows how this process goes from frontal lobes through motor cortex back through language and emotional areas, and is kind of a loop, a continuous loop here, and it's involved with other networks, especially the attention network, as well as motivational or reward networks. Another way to look at the neurophysiology of executive functions is a diagram here looking at the different networks and particular hubs that are important. The main hub of greatest importance in executive functions has to do with the prefrontal cortex, but there's a lot of back and forth going on between different areas of the brain, between memory areas of the brain related to reward mechanisms, other things like that. So this is not a schematic diagram of the brain. This is showing neural pathways that are connected based on physical areas as well as functioning of certain parts of the brain. So what are the benefits of executive functions over the lifespan? And with permission, I'm using Adele Diamond's slides from a couple years back that she shared with us in the course. The benefits can be summarized as being more creativity and cognitive flexibility, greater self-control or inhibitory control, selective attention, and discipline and perseverance, as well as working memory, which has benefits to all academic subjects in school. In Adele's presentation, she highlighted a wonderful study by Duckworth and Seligman, which talked about the evidence that shows that discipline accounts for over twice as much variation in final grades as IQ, even in college. So this idea of having self-discipline, being able to focus, being able to choose what is important, being able to decide what you're going to pay attention to is actually more valuable in determining final grades than what you're born with. This is really key to our nature-nurture conversation where we're always discussing what is really more important, right? Adele also shared with us that children with less inhibitory control, who were less persistent, who were more impulsive, they had poorer attention regulation, as adults, 30 years later, as adults actually had worse health, they earned less, they committed more crimes than those who had better inhibitory control. So we see that inhibitory control mechanisms, they have other consequences that go far beyond just academics. And if you're interested in this study, this is a Moffitt study in 2011. Other things, and this is a chart summarized in Diamond in 2013, she looked at different aspects of life, such as mental health, physical health, the quality of life, school readiness, school success, job success, marital harmony, public safety, and try to cross that with ways that executive functions are relevant to that particular aspect of life. and found many, many studies that support that there's an influence of executive functions on all of these different aspects of your life. Your mental health is influenced by good executive functions. Your physical health is related to executive functions. Your general overall quality of life is related to executive functions. Being ready for school, school success, job success, even how long or how well you stay married is related to executive functions, as is public safety and criminals. Criminals typically have lower executive function levels than other members of society. So what is the stability of executive functions over the lifetime? Well, we know that they change. They change over the lifespan throughout developmental stages. They also change based on your particular emotional state. So in one single day, you can actually have good moments of executive functions working correctly and other moments where they're actually frozen. And this interplays a bit with this idea of dynamic skill theory, in which there's this regression advancement of your ability to deal with situations that require good or strong executive function execution. And if we look at this over the lifespan, Turner and Spreng's data provide the first quantitative meta-analytic evidence that age-related patterns of functional brain change during executive functions depend on specific control processes being challenged. That is, some things related to working memory might go down, whereas things related to inhibitory control could go up. So depending on the sub-element of executive functions, you found differences here. In a different study by Kay and colleagues, they have a hypothesis. There's successful aging in which cognitive decline is reduced by successful maintenance of executive function. So that's also something really worth looking at if you're interested in this particular topic. What was very interesting about Turner and Spreng's findings, however, is that when they documented how executive function networks exist in the brain related to working memory and inhibition, they documented this in children as well as adults, and they found that there was absolutely no difference. When they conducted tasks with adults as with younger subjects, they found that exactly the same areas were still stimulated. So the neurophysiology of executive functions is maintained into old age. So we have 5 key premises about executive functions, and these are the big ideas that I hope that you can take away from this particular class. Executive function skills do not develop automatically. They take effort to mature and improve. Now this might sound counterintuitive because we've talked a lot about the way that the brain cannot help but learn. That is true, but higher order thinking, things like executive functions, do not develop all by themselves. Remember, we talked about this with metacognition. These things need to be coached, developed, and trained for them to thrive. Secondly, executive functions, which including reasoning, working memory, self-control, they can always be improved. So it's not that you reach a peak and then you freeze. You can always improve executive functions throughout the lifespan. Third, executive functions need to be progressively challenged as children improve, which means that repeated practice is really the key. So you cannot just say, okay, I've mastered executive functions. Throughout the lifespan, you have to also increase the activity that you do. You have to get progressively more difficult in all of these different tasks, in working memory tasks, in inhibitory control tasks, as well as cognitive flexibility. And executive function skills may lay the foundation for not only academic achievement, but also for general well-being. As we saw in these long-term studies by Duckworth and colleagues, Moffitt, executive functions are critical for school and job success and for mental and physical health. And the fifth point is that executive functions travel similar circuits in the brain related to emotional processing, which is related to the frontal lobe, as we talked about last week when we discussed affective neuroscience. This means that executive functions and the prefrontal cortex are the first to suffer, and suffer disproportionately if you are stressed, sad, lonely, or not physically fit. So your ability to do higher order thinking is compromised when you are emotionally stressed. So all of these points, the definition of executive functions as well as the sub-elements we just talked about and the premises we talked about, give us a clue as to why it's really difficult to map executive functions in the brain. This means that you have to map all the attention networks, as well as working memory networks, as well as decision-making networks, as well as emotional pathways. There's a lot of things involved in executive functions. So when we talk about executive functions, we We tend to glibly say that, well, this increases it, or he has low or high executive functions, when we should really be more precise in saying, well, he has poor working memory ability, or he's not able to be cognitively flexible. We should be much more precise when we critique executive functions because they are so charged with content. So how can you improve executive functions? Can you improve executive functions? As we mentioned before, if you remember the key premise there, you must improve executive functions. It's kind of like a no way out here. If you just freeze at a certain level, you will not develop to your full potential. So what are some types of things that could be successful interventions? Well, there's evidence out there, and I have to preface this with a big parentheses. There is a big critique of the information that exists. Precisely due to this point, there are a lot of criticisms about the research related to executive functions because people say, well, that's not complete. You're only measuring decision making, or you're only measuring working memory, or you're only measuring inhibitory control. Therefore, you're not measuring executive functions with all of the sub-elements. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind when we talk about improvement of executive functions. Many people say that the successful interventions, well, this helps you with attention, or this piece helps you with working memory, or this piece helps you with cognitive flexibility. But are any of these exercises, or do any of these activities or interventions actually attend to all executive functions? So as we mentioned, there are many sub-elements that can be improved. So there's lots of evidence out there that exercise boosts working memory, that you can increase inhibitory skills with training, or you can improve mental flexibility. All of these sub-elements of executive functions have very thorough documentation, but executive functions as a whole are very hard to show that a single intervention improves all of these different aspects. Other evidence that's out there, computer-based training, believe it or not, traditional martial arts, types of school curricula, aerobics, yoga, mindfulness, learning a foreign language, musical training, all of these things have some evidence behind them. And rather than say it's black or white, I'd like to offer some examples of that to you. For example, in music related to executive function training, there are some studies out there that talk about how music, or people who are trained musically, are better at certain elements of executive function. Attention, working memory, definitely. So have a look at those studies if you're interested. So here's an example of the studies, and this is why they have, you know, powerful evidence behind them, but they're also critiqued because they do not have huge sample sizes. For example, in this study by Zuck, Benjamin, Kenyon, and Gab, so they did 2 experiments, one with adults, one with kids, mixing adults who had musical training and who didn't have musical training, as well as with children who were musically trained and musically untrained. And they were matched for general cognitive ability, socioeconomic status, and they used fMRI studies to find what? They discovered in this study is that overall musicians showed enhanced performance on several constructs, several sub-elements of executive functions. And musically trained children further showed heightened brain activation in traditional regions of executive functions when they did task switching, which has a lot to do with attention. So what did they find? Overall, that musicians showed enhanced performance in several constructs or several sub-elements of executive functions, including things that had to do with attention and working memory. So it supports a hypothesis that musical training may promote the development and maintenance of certain executive function skills, which could mediate the previously reported links between musical training and enhanced cognitive skills and academic achievement. So the link between musicians and maybe doing well on some types of math is not because of the direct connection between music and math, but rather because of enhanced executive functions. A second group of studies has to do with the bilingual edge. Is there a benefit to executive functions when you're bilingual? Well, several studies seem to support that. Native bilinguals have higher scores on executive functioning tasks than late bilinguals or than monolingual counterparts. What is the edge? It seems to be there's greater inhibitory control, greater meta-linguistic understanding, and greater sensitivity to socioeconomic interactions with others based on gut study. And whole books or chapters of books that go beyond language, that talk about childhood bilingualism, which enhance high-level cognitive functions, including executive functions. And this is something that is seen early. There's early evidence of executive functions in early bilinguals. Children as young as 7 months old who are raised with 2 languages from birth display improved cognitive control abilities compared with matched monolinguals. So it seems to be that being bilingual enhances this element of cognitive control or inhibitory control in the bilingual brain. A third area of interventions has to do with exercise. And we divide exercise, at least in this study by Verberg and colleagues, into two different types of exercise: chronic versus acute physical exercise. So what did they do? They did a meta-analysis of the literature. They looked at three different age groups. They looked at pre-adolescent kids, adolescents, as well as young adults. And they tried to figure out if acute exercise, which was defined as a single short-term exercise bout, typically spanning about 10 to 40 minutes, versus chronic exercise, which consists of an exercise program of multiple training sessions per week for a longer period of time, typically between 6 and 30 weeks long in length. So it was longer during each day and it was longer over time as well. To see whether or not exercise influenced executive control, they reviewed the literature, and the meta-analytic effects were calculated for both acute physical exercise as well as chronic physical exercise. And they found that there was a significant overall positive effect of acute physical exercise on executive function. And there was no significant difference between the three different age groups. That was surprising, right? And furthermore, they found that there was no significant overall effect of chronic physical exercise. This means that acute physical exercise, the exercise in which you have shorter bouts, single short-term bouts of exercise of 10 to 40 minutes, were more beneficial to executive functions than doing prolonged chronic physical exercise. And there's a whole other group of studies that's related to physical exercise, but within the sub-area of martial arts. And I throw this in here as a question to you. Could we consider this, or conceptualize martial arts as actually being mindful exercise? It's not just doing this chronic exercise where you're pumping the bike and going uphill, but it's where you're taking a slow amount of time to think about actually what you're doing, your physical movements. Well, in Lake's study, which is reported in Diamond's article, they found that when they randomly assigned, they had two different classes, and one was either assigned to a regular PE class and the other one had 2 sessions of Taekwondo a week. And the Taekwondo sessions included explicit techniques related to self-control. So these 60 students were evaluated, and after a year, 9 months of schooling, or 9 months of this class, the majority of Taekwondo students reported positive perceptions of class, as well as improvements in self-control and physical fitness. So the results suggest that Taekwondo is an exercise program that improves cognitive functioning, is both feasible and acceptable to implement in public school settings. In other studies, this is also Lake again with another colleague earlier on, with a larger group of students, she found that even just 3 months of intervention, it didn't have to do with this 9 month of intervention, but just 3 months of intervention, the martial arts group, or the ones who did Taekwondo, had greater improvements in cognitive self-regulation, affective self-regulation, pro-social behavior, classroom conduct, and performance on mental math tests. So these findings seem to support that it would be beneficial to include some kind of martial arts, Taekwondo for example, if we are out to improve executive functions. And this doesn't have to be something that takes up extra time in the curriculum. It could be something that's included in normal physical education classes. Another area of intervention has to do with computer-based training programs to enhance executive functions. And these work on stimulating memory systems as well as purposeful attention. So in one study that was done by Daly, Nyberg, Beckman, and Neely in 2008, they found that after just 5 weeks of computer training, that even 18 months later, there was an impact on working memory in younger as well as older adult subjects. So the training consisted of a technique to memorize different letter patterns, and they were able to do this even 18 months later. So the training stuck with them long term. But being able to transfer and to use that type of learning in new situations actually was limited to the younger students in general. So the findings demonstrate substantial and durable plasticity of executive function training across adulthood and into old age, although there appear to be age-related constraints in the ability to generalize the acquired updating skill, so being able to transfer or use this in new situations. So many of you must be thinking, there's got to be a relationship. We've been talking about affective neuroscience, we talked about metacognition, we talked about things of self-regulation, we looked into the concept of emotional intelligence. In the coming weeks, we're going to be looking at theory of mind. How are they all related? What is the difference between emotional intelligence and executive functions if they both have to do with cognitive control and self-regulation, right? What is the relationship between executive functions and well-being, performance, and achievement? And how are executive functions, emotional intelligence, and theory of mind related? Are those concepts one and the same, or do they have crossover areas? To help answer this question, let's look at this bigger concept of self-regulation and how is it connected to executive functions. So in Tops and colleagues' study, they found that self-regulation and its neural substrates have been studied by neuroscientists for a long time. And self-regulation is considered to be directly related to inhibitory control in the brain. And it's also very, very important for school success. So a partial answer to this question then is that maybe it's not executive functions, maybe it's just self-regulation that's important. So the sub-element of executive functions, inhibitory control, which is directly connected to self-regulation, is a key factor in performance and learning across the lifespan. Other studies showed self-regulation is something that you develop early in life, but it can be refined throughout the lifespan. So one idea is to look at this as a habituated action that also has to be learned early. There was a discussion in our class, I believe, on the discussion board, somebody mentioning how important it was for kids to understand the concept of no, being able to resist, to self-regulate, and to, don't crawl headfirst down the stairs or whatever it is, just no. And young children, as we saw in these earlier studies, 6, 7 months old, are able to understand that and begin to have self-regulating practices. A very important idea to bring into this conversation related to last week's discussion on language has to do with the early development of executive functions and the key role that words play. Remember that we talked about the idea that Vygotsky proposed that symbols, and particularly words, serve as mental tools, and they can be used to service self-regulation. Bellatoon and Ayub conducted a study in 2011, which was longitudinal. It collected data from 120 toddlers when they were 14 months old, 24 months old, 36 months old, and to test the impact of their language skill as it related or correlated with self-regulation, to see if there was a relationship to the amount of words that a person used and the way that they were able to self-regulate. And what did they find? That vocabulary ends up being a better predictor of self-regulation than talkativeness. So it's not just using lots of words over and over and over again. It's having a bigger vocabulary and ways to express different things. And vocabulary was positively correlated then with self-regulation. And if you compare what would be this typical developmental tract of boys and girls, it was found that boys with better vocabulary were able to parallel a timeline that was more similar of girls. So it's very important to consider that this might be beneficial to all kids. But as boys' expressive language tends to be more limited in vocabulary, the idea that increasing vocabulary might be beneficial to self-regulation, which in turn would benefit executive function development. If you recall the emotional intelligence, we talked about these 4 elements, right? Yourself, and being able to recognize within yourself an emotion and then being able to regulate it, and then being able to extend, once you have self-awareness of your situation or of the emotions in your life, then you're able to then broaden out and be able to work with others on this. You can identify those emotions in others as well as manage those emotions in other people. And the key connector here between emotional intelligence and executive functions has to do with the slide that we saw earlier related to the impact of negative emotional states on executive functions. Stress can make us look like we have ADHD, says Diamond in her video. So we know that children in negative or stress situations, their executive functions do not work well. So she suggests very strongly that children need to feel joyful, relaxed, not stressed. They need to be in a supportive community and be surrounded by people they can count on. And their bodies need to be fit and healthy. And with all of those things in place to allow for successful executive function development and therefore all of the benefits that come with strong executive functions, including academic success. Now we're going to watch a video of Adele Diamond explaining executive functions.
Okay, now on to my talk for today. What abilities and skills will be needed for success in the 21st century? Well, one of them is self-control. Having the self-control to resist temptations and not act impulsively. To think before we speak or act, so we don't do something we'd regret or put our foot in our mouths. To wait before making up our minds, so we don't jump to a conclusion or prejudge. Another is discipline and perseverance. Having the discipline to stay on task and complete it. To resist temptations to quit because you're bored, you're frustrated. There are a lot more fun things to do. Continuing to work even though the reward might be a long time in coming. Also, creativity in seeing connections between seemingly unconnected ideas or facts, playing with information and ideas in your mind, relating one to another, then disassembling those combinations and putting the elements together in new ways. Working memory involves holding information in mind and working with it. It's critical for things like reasoning. And creativity in seeing familiar things in new ways, from different perspectives. If one way of solving a problem isn't working, can we conceive of the problem in a different way? Can we think outside the box to attack the problem in a different way? And finally, flexibility. Having the flexibility to take advantage of serendipity, to navigate around unforeseen obstacles, and to admit we were wrong when we get more information. Executive functions is shorthand for all of the abilities I just mentioned. And executive functions happen to be my specialty. Executive functions are important for every aspect of life. Success in school, success in the workplace, making and keeping friends, marital harmony, and avoiding things like unplanned pregnancy, substance abuse, or driving fatalities. In other words, self-control, creativity, reasoning, mental flexibility, discipline, and perseverance are really important, and they're often more predictive than IQ. If you want your child to do well in school and in life, help your child develop healthy executive functions. The good news is that executive functions can be improved. In fact, many different activities have been shown to improve executive functions, including computerized training, games, aerobics, traditional martial arts, yoga, mindfulness, and certain school curricula like Tools of the Mind, Montessori, and Paths. I predict that the activities that will most successfully improve executive functions are those that not only train and challenge executive functions, but also indirectly support executive functions by lessening things that impair them and enhancing things that support them. Now, what things impair and what things support executive functions? Executive functions depend on prefrontal cortex and the other neural regions with which it is interconnected. Prefrontal cortex is the newest area of the brain and the most vulnerable. If you're sad or stressed, lonely, sleep-deprived, or not physically fit, prefrontal cortex and executive functions will be the first to suffer and will suffer the most. Stress impairs executive functions and causes anyone to look as if he or she has an executive function impairment, like ADHD, when that's not the case at all. When you're stressed, you probably can't think as clearly or exercise as good self-control. When I'm stressed, I reach for the chocolate. If you're stressed, you can't be the teacher or parent you want to be. You need to be able to relax. Don't get all stressed and down on yourself because you're not the perfect parent. Remember, imperfect is not the same as worthless. Even the people you most respect make mistakes and have done things they regret. Everyone makes mistakes and everyone is imperfect. Yet each of us is wonderful in our own way. You can be a terrific parent even though you're not the perfect parent. Your humanity is more important than your knowledge or skill or doing the textbook perfect thing. Your caring, your openness to truly listen when your child needs you, to be there for your child, is more important than your knowledge or skill. One major source of stress for many children is feeling that they're not smart enough, that they can't learn and will not succeed. It's important to communicate loud and clear the faith and expectation that each child will succeed. When a toddler falls while trying to walk, we never say, "You get a D in walking today." It would never occur to us. We say, "Don't worry, I'm sure you're going to be able to do this." How different is that from what children hear in school? They hear you get a D instead of, "Don't worry, there's no question you're going to be able to do this. And we together are going to figure out a way to make that happen." A school in British Columbia has as its motto, "If you can't learn the way we teach, we'll teach the way you learn." How terrific is that? Children need to believe in themselves. For example, there's a stereotype in our culture that men are better in math than women. And sure enough, when a group of researchers went to a university and gave a standardized math test, as a group, the male students performed better than the female students. Then the researchers tested another group of entirely comparable university students on exactly the same exam. The only difference was they added one sentence before the exam. They said, "This particular test has been designed to be gender neutral. On this particular test, women perform as well as men." And what happened? The women performed as well as the men. It was the same test the first group got. The only difference was whether the women expected themselves to do well or not. Our expectations for ourselves often become self-fulfilling prophecies. Many children are so terrified of making a mistake that they're afraid to try anything new. Making a mistake is not the worst thing in the world. We need to let children know it's okay to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The only alternative is to stay with what you already know and stop growing. The important thing is how you react after you've made a mistake or fallen short of a goal. I love this quote, and I particularly love it because of who said it. You've never failed until you tried for the last time, and you've never lost until you quit. Samuel Proctor Macy was born in the segregated South in the early 1900s. You know he experienced a lot of discrimination, setbacks, and failures. Yet he rose to become one of the most highly respected and decorated chemists of the 20th century. You haven't failed until you stop trying. If children are afraid to try something new, afraid they'll be penalized for a mistake, we need to show them that they'll be rewarded for trying. If what gets graded is what children see as important, we need to reward them with an A under a new category, the courage to try something new, to risk being wrong. Let's return to what things impair and what things support executive functions. Our brains work better when we're not feeling lonely or socially isolated, and that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. In one study, researchers told a group of subjects that they would have close relationships throughout their lives. They told another group the opposite, and a third group unrelated bad news. On simple memorization questions that don't require prefrontal cortex, all three groups perform comparably. But on logical reasoning that requires executive functions, those told to expect that they'd be lonely performed worse. Other researchers haven't tried to manipulate this. They simply give subjects a survey when they come in the lab, and that includes questions like, do you feel socially supported? Do you feel lonely? And one research group found that prefrontal cortex functions more efficiently in those who report they feel more lonely and isolated. We are fundamentally social. We need to belong. We need to fit in and be liked. Children who are lonely or ostracized will have more difficulty learning. And it's not just peers. A close relationship with a caring adult can be huge. Our brains work better when our bodies are physically fit, and that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. Our brains don't recognize the same sharp division between cognitive and motor function that we impose in our thinking. The same or substantially overlapping brain systems subserve both cognitive and motor function. For example, one region of the brain called the pre-SMA is important for sequential tasks, and it doesn't matter whether they're sequential motor tasks or sequential cognitive tasks. The different parts of the human being are fundamentally interrelated. Each part is affected by and affects the other parts. Let's return to my prediction. Those activities that most successfully improve executive functions should not only work on training and improving executive functions, but also indirectly support executive functions by working to reduce things that impair them and working to enhance things that support them. Well, what activities directly train and challenge executive functions and indirectly support them by also addressing our social, emotional, and physical needs? Traditional activities that have been around for millennia, for tens of thousands of years across all cultures. Storytelling, dance, art, music, and play have been part of the human condition. People in all cultures made music, sang, danced, did sports, and played games. There are good reasons why those activities have lasted so long and arose everywhere. Certainly, they help develop motor skills such as bimanual and eye-hand coordination, balance, strength and flexibility, and lung capacity. And they also train and challenge executive functions. In this short video, you'll see the National Dance Institute.
The basis of the NDITT is setting high standards for children. NDI teachers just don't accept mediocrity.
The movement itself is very challenging, and they're constantly changing directions, changing counts. People are doing things at different times. That's a big concept for kids at this age.
It's a lot easier to focus because when you learn to focus on something that's fun, sometimes, if you want to, you can learn to focus on something that's not so fun.
These activities also address our social needs, providing feelings of belonging and social support. Here, you'll first see the National Dance Institute, and then rather abruptly, the video will switch to youth circus, and you'll see 2 or 3 different youth circus groups.
They learn to understand that each one of them is an important element to the success of the whole team.
As a kid, it's like if you're in class and you feel like you're not succeeding in class, NDI was the one place where if you didn't get the step, you didn't quit. You had everyone supporting you and encouraging you, and you got it.
When the children dance, their differences disappear. Whatever challenges they face in their home life or their private life or at school, they leave that at the stage door, and they all become dancers, an ensemble of dancers.
It really teaches you to work with each other, not just an individual, but that they must count on each other, trust each other, be aware of each other, listen to each other.
So, what is art cirque? Circus, in fact, is just a pretext to create a circle of trust, and it's a space where people can communicate with each other, an area where you can work on yourself, trust the other, and dream.
And of course, they provide joy, building children's feelings of pride and self-confidence. Here, you'll first see youth circus, then El Sistema Orchestra, and finally the National Dance Institute.
It makes accepting challenges in school and in other areas of their life much easier.
It meets them in a way that allows them to just move ahead a little at a time. And the little at a time that they move ahead, they very slowly develop a belief in themselves.
Last year at the proms, here in the Royal Albert Hall, something amazing happened. A huge orchestra of kids from the shanty towns of Venezuela came to play Shostakovich's 10th Symphony.
Abrea, but he believes in the orchestra as a unique instrument for socializing children, for giving them discipline, for giving them passion. For kids that maybe haven't succeeded in anything else, maybe don't speak very well, don't do math, you see these kids getting better at everything because it gives them that kind of investment in their own identity. As I can do this.
You'll see a transformation when you go watch an NDI class. When you are young and you do something positive, you've achieved something. That sticks with you all your life.
I shudder to think what I might be doing if NDI hadn't come along when they did. NDI made me feel special, because no one else did. They took a chance on a kid they didn't even know.
We provide the program for an entire grade level. It's not an audition program. Every child participates, and if they commit, they are guaranteed success.
Music, dance, circus, theater, positive sports, and more address our physical, cognitive, emotional, and social needs. Therefore, I predict they should improve executive functions. But that's only a prediction because, incredibly, there is no hard scientific evidence on the benefits of any of these activities for executive functions. There's lots of evidence of correlations. For example, students in band or sports often do better in school. But we have no way of knowing if they might have done better in school anyway, even if they hadn't been in band or sports. There's lots of anecdotal data, testimonials, and personal accounts of how these activities have transformed kids' lives. And there are good theoretical reasons, such as I've presented here, derived from solid scientific data that these activities should help. But the hard scientific evidence is missing. My grant applications to fund basic neuroscience research, like the role of dopamine in prefrontal cortex, sail through scientific review and have been continuously funded by the government for over 25 years. But when I request funding for solid research on the benefits of dance, music like El Sistema, or heaven forbid, youth circus, reviewers' eyes glaze over. They say, study dance? That sounds flaky. So I'm hoping that people who share my belief that these activities can transform kids' lives might step forward to help fund the research that's so badly needed. Research showing hard data on the benefits of these activities for executive functions is sorely needed because these activities, the arts, physical exercise, and play, are being squeezed out of school curricula to make more time for academic instruction. While it may seem logical that if you want to improve academic outcomes, you should concentrate on academic outcomes alone, not everything that seems logical is correct. Counterintuitively, the most efficient and effective strategy for advancing academic achievement is probably not to focus on academics only. We need to care about the whole child if we want to improve academic achievement. If we focus only on academics, we are less likely to succeed. The arts, play, and physical activity may be critical for achieving the outcomes we all want for our children. Thank you very much.
Great. So try to keep some of her ideas in mind when you talk about risk and protective factors, as well as when we evaluate or you think about the types of things that can contribute to executive function refinement. So this poses a big question to us in society and to our family life. What do we need to improve the chances of developing strong executive functions? And what are the consequences if we don't do this? What are the consequences of inadequate systems to develop executive functions? What would be the consequences of schools that don't nurture the development of good executive functions? So I think it's important to close by reflecting on this as a group, because this is the responsibility that we all carry, right? Do we have schools and training programs that understand the importance of executive functions for long-term benefit, not only academic benefits, but the benefits that might exist for society? Do they understand why school curriculum that ignores children's emotional, social, or physical needs may find that those unmet needs work against them when they only prize academic goals? You can't reach academic goals if you don't have strong executive functions. And do we ourselves understand the potential importance of bilingualism, play, dance, music, mindfulness, martial arts, youth circus, computer training, all of these other ideas of interventions that could potentially develop executive functions? And finally, have we all reflected sufficiently on creating those spaces that develop executive functions in our daily lives? Is there a space for enhancing working memory? Is there a space for practicing inhibitory control? Are there activities in our lives that help us be cognitively flexible, or do we have habituated reactions to circumstances in our lives that do develop those things? To close, I want you to think about your personal risk and protective factors related to executive functions. What are the risk factors in your life related to executive functions? What are the potential protective factors in your life related to executive functions that you have yet to employ? What is something new that you might be able to add into your daily routine which would enhance the probability of improved executive functions? Okay, so what did we try to do? We looked at the definitions and characteristics of executive functions. We talked a bit about the neurophysiology of executive functions and the pathways in the brain. We shared 5 premises, key ideas related to executive functions. We talked about a sampling of some of the studies that consider ways to enhance executive function development in individuals. And finally, you were asked to consider your own risk and protective factors related to executive function development. And with that, we finish. Remember, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm looking forward to working with you next week. Take care.